is anarchism? Anarchism is not a doctrine. It's not something invented by a thinker. It's not a set of principles and values. It's not an ideal about what society should be. That, my friends, would be idealism. That would be the most superficial acquaintance with the actual meaning of the word anarchism, because it neglects a few things, a few crucial things from a materialist perspective. One, it neglects the crucial changes in actual history that gave rise to that very stance and perspective in the first place. It neglects what that actually means in practice on a material level in relation to the state. It also neglects, most importantly and most fundamentally, it ignores the underlying aesthetic that actually defines anarchism. So, what is an aesthetic? Is an aesthetic just like a costume and a cosmetic thing? No, most dumb fucks look at the word aesthetic and they're like, oh, an aesthetic? That's like just a superficial appearance of something. No, an aesthetic is the deeper way in which we make sense of the world. Now, the reason this particular literary use of the word aesthetic has fallen out of favor is because with empiricism and a bunch of other mentally retarded trends, we've come to think that we all just share the same sense of the world, and that the only sense of the world we can have is the empirical, whatever, scientific kind, right? But there's also another sense in which you can make sense of the world, which would be broadly, understood within either a critique of ideology, let's say in an Althusserian sense. It could be in a psychoanalytic sense, like in the case of Lacan or the post-Lacanian theorists. It could also be in a religious sense of the underlying kind of religious structure, right? About, how people say, well, communism is actually Christian and yada, yada, yada. So there's a multitude of ways in which you can think about how we make sense of the world in different ways, how the world and meaning becomes coherent to us in various different ways, right? I'm not just talking about our physical senses. I'm talking about like how we find meaning in the world, which is like the most important thing for a fucking human being, right? So that's what an aesthetic is. An aesthetic is not just an appearance. It's not just a superficial costume. It's the deeper way in which we make sense of the world. That is what an aesthetic is. It means deeper sense. So when you think of the word aesthetic, I want you to think deeper sense. And it's this deeper aesthetic that actually does define what anarchism is. It's not defined by what the self-proclaimed theorists of anarchism decide anarchism should be. It is defined by the actual way in which anarchists respond to the antagonisms of the modern world, right? And how they make sense, more importantly, how they make sense of those contradictions and antagonism. Now, that's going to sound like a whole lot of nothing, but as I continue to delve into the origins of anarchism and fill this whole thing with content, I think it's going to be made pretty clear. So the first thing I want to do to introduce you to what anarchism is, the crucial context, I should rather say, that gave rise to what is called anarchism and anarchistic thinking, is a poem. It's a poem by a guy named Percy Shelley, poet of English Romanticism. And the poem is called The Mask of Anarchy. Percy Shelley wrote this poem, The Mask of Anarchy, in the context of the world transformed after the French Revolution. And in this poem, he basically denounces the hypocrisy of the status quo, of the monarchy and of the police and of the law and of property and all of the priests and the clerics. And he basically gives expression to the fact that all of these seemingly substantive forms of the state, of religiosity, everything that is holy, sacred, property, law, monarchy, all of these are masks which disguise their opposite. They are the masks of anarchy. So I'm going to read you some lines, right? He wore a kingly crown, and in his grasp a scepter shone. On his brow this mark I saw, I am God and King and law. With a pace stately and fast, over English land he passed, trampling to the mire of blood the adoring multitude. So in this poem, Shelley is kind of talking about how something has happened, this is my interpretation at least, that this mask is increasingly being worn and it's being used as an excuse to trample over the English people in some kind of way, right? This is the rising proletariat is occurring at this time. You've got an increasing level of social unrest. And also you're dealing with the context after the English Civil War, which is probably the most important context that I'm going to explore here to actually derive the origins of anarchism, right? And each dweller, panic-stricken, felt his heart terror-stricken. hearing the tempestuous cry of the triumph of anarchy. So he's talking about basically this force, which is wearing the mask of God, king, and law, but actually represents the triumph of some kind of anarchy. Now, how could that be, right? Well, that's why it's a mask, right? For with pomp to meet his came, clothed in arms like blood and flame, the hired murderers who did his sing, thou art God and law and king. So they sang, this is what they were singing. Then she lay down in the street, right before the horse's feet, expecting with a patient eye, murder, fraud, and anarchy, right? So these three things, God, law, and whatever, monarchy, whatever the crown, it's actually murder, fraud, and anarchy, right? He's exposing the hypocrisy, basically. He's engaging in this unity of apparently contrary associations, which is what art pretty much is, by the way. Then all cried in one accord, thou art king and God and Lord, anarchy, to thee we bow, be thy name made holy now. And anarchy, the skeleton, bowed and grinned to everyone, as well as if his education had cost 10 millions to the nation. And anarchy, the ghastly birth, lay dead upon the earth, the horse of death, tameless as wind, field, and with his hooves did grind to dust the murderers throng behind. Thematically, the point of his poem, more or less, it's pretty simple, right? All of these things that have come to epitomize the legitimacy of the status quo of his time. And when was this poem written exactly? I think it was, 1832. So this is about 40 years, maybe like let's say just half a century after the French Revolution. All of the things that have epitomized the legitimacy of the status quo of his time, actually it's a mask disguising some kind of anarchy. Now, what is this anarchy? Again, I'm not going to proceed from, we're going to talk about Godwin and we're going to talk about Proudhon. Well, I'm going to talk about Proudhon, believe it or not, but that's not what defines what anarchism is. What defines what anarchism is a deeper aesthetic. Again, it's a deeper way of making sense of contradictions of the era. Now, I just exposed to you the premier contradiction that would give rise to anarchism and all sorts of political sentiment and radicalism, which is this apparent contradiction between the way in which the ruling order is trying to legitimize itself and its actually existing reality. Like Shelley's saying, right? You say that you represent God and law and the crown, and that you engage in all of these criminal excesses that clearly point to us the opposite, right? Or in the words of Proudhon himself, right? Property is theft, right? Property is theft. So in the same way that property is theft, according to Proudhon, for Shelley here, the monarchical state of Britain at the time, and this is after the French Revolution, it's some kind of anarchy. So now that we've got that clear, we're going to talk about the English Civil War a little bit, right? And I can't get too into this. I mean, I could literally go on for hours if I really want to give this its justice. But more or less, the Reformation did something interesting, right? This rejection of the church and the authority of the church pretty much had set everything, it called everything into question, right? With the Protestant Reformation, yada, yada, yada. Namely, like, okay, our way of mediating our relationship to the divine was clearly false. The Catholic Church is the Antichrist, yada, 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 right? So if that's the case, what else have we been getting wrong? So all of a sudden, everything gets called into question. Everything. And the most important of those things that gets called into question is the state, the legitimacy of the state. All of a sudden, the state goes from something that's just kind of there, that you're not really able to think critically about in any kind of way. And I'll be like, what about the ancient Greeks? Just shut up. You don't know what you're talking about, okay? I'm not going to get into it. But more or less, you're not able to really think critically about the state. It's just something kind of there that you take for granted. It's in the background. Now, the English Civil War, with this very shocking and also religiously motivated execution of the monarchy, basically gave rise to a vacuum at the heart of the state's legitimacy. Before you had this kind of rule by tradition and it's all very legitimate and yada, yada, yada. All of a sudden that gets replaced by a vacuum. People rose up, killed their monarch, and now the question of what is a state is put on new grounding. What is a state? So the first definition of anarchy that I'm going to proceed with here is that of anarchy is the vacuum of statehood in the age of European modernity. Anarchism is the vacuum of statehood. That is the first definition I'm going to proceed with. Not revolution, It's this fundamental vacuum that paradoxically also comes to represent the very substance of statehood. Now, in which theorist does the vacuum of statehood, this nothingness, this emptiness, also come to epitomize the metaphysical substance of the state? Okay? It's none other than a person that you would not expect to be an anarchist, Thomas Hobbes. For Thomas Hobbes, in his understanding of what is the basis of a state, Hobbes does not say the basis of the state is the divine. It's God-given. He also doesn't say the basis of the state is some patriarchal tradition. He also doesn't say, as in the case of the classical antiquity, the basis of the state is some kind of mythology. It's this founding, poetically contrived myth that allows us to relate to whatever our being, yada, yada, yada. For Hobbes, the basis of the state lies in this fundamental relation of all against all produced in the vacuum of state power. And he's actually getting this from the chaos that he experienced and which defined his environment during the English Civil War. Okay? So in the English Civil War, the king is beheaded, right? A lot of people confuse the French Revolution for the English Civil War in terms of their significance. A lot of people think, oh, during the French Revolution, when they beheaded the king, that pretty much overturned and set and put everything on its head and question. No, that happened during the English Civil War, when they beheaded their king and queen during the English Civil War, okay? So in terms of being able to understand and define the legitimacy of the state, what we're dealing with during the English Civil War is more or less a vacuum. We're dealing with a vacuum. We can't draw from any prior traditions. We can't draw from anything that's intuitive or natural to us. Everything's been thrown in the air. Everything gets called into question. And it's like that Cartesian reduction. Descartes, he's experiencing the chaos of knowledge, right? And he says, in response to this chaos, I think, therefore I am. I can't know if everything I know about the world is given to me by a demon, so I'm going to take refuge only in the certainty that I have that I'm capable of thought, right? Now, the same thing happened during the English Civil War. I cannot take refuge in any of these different authorities that are claiming to represent the true authority. So the only thing that I can take refuge in is in the immediate substantive basis, metaphysically speaking, of what gives rise to a social relation, right? Which is, for Hobbes at least, a relationship of hostility. When one individual's interests clash with the interests of another individual, somehow a third term arises which has to give expression and has to raise itself above them if they're going to be able to coexist in any kind of way. So the essence of statehood basically becomes reduced in some kind of way to some constitutive violence between individuals, between individual substances. But notice the key word here is individual. Anarchism proceeds necessarily with a metaphysical and methodological individualism of the state. For anarchists, the state is simply some form of power over individuals. The basis, moreover, of the power of the state is also individual. Now, skipping forward some hundreds of years, right? Which other thinker do we find this kind of idea from? Who's also a big founding thinker of anarchism. By the way, we're going to talk about this idea of founding thinkers of anarchism as well. It's Stirner. Max Stirner basically proceeds with this idea, drawing from this metaphysical revolution that begins with England during the early modernity, right? He's basically taking that for granted. Max Stirner kind of says, all of these notions you have of a state and a society and a country and a collective and religion, these are all spooks. And why are they spooks? Why are they ghosts? Because the only measurably real things in reality are individuals. Individuals are the only substantive real things we can measure in actually reality. When you're talking about some state, or you're talking about laws, or you're talking about a country or some higher form of collectivity, how the fuck do you measure that? Right? You can't. So all of these things basically disguise the individual interests of individuals. Only individuals are real. Now, why is it that only individuals are real? Because only individuals are immediately verifiable in our experience. I can't touch a state. I can't incarnate the state in this direct way, right? So I have to directly kind of ground that in something. Now, that's what someone like Thomas Hobbes and Max Stirner have in common. People you'd think are completely unrelated, opposite thinkers do have in common the idea that the power of the state is grounded in some atomic metaphysical substance. It's this that they both agree on, namely the substance of individuality and the antagonism individuals pose to one another by default. Is everyone following me so far? Because I'm just laying some groundwork. Great, excellent. So obviously the French Revolution casts upon Europe this newfound mask of anarchy in a way that the English Civil War didn't. Because from the period of the English Civil War up to the French Revolution, the mask was more or less well intact. The veneer of some kind of, and I said this in my speech at CPI, the veneer that the state, the legitimacy of the state, and its continuity with the older kind of patriarchal feudal forms was maintained. However, the truth of the matter is, and this is the case when you investigate it, there was a huge discontinuity sometime during early modernity and with the Protestant Reformation and 30 Years' War in particular, the European wars of religion. These wars and these events somehow from within overturn the basis of state power. And what I mean by that is that while it appeared that the forms of tradition and legitimation of the state that had been inherited from feudalism were intact, those were just disguising some kind of atheistic, cold, calculated, and abstract form of political power, some kind of utilitarian form of power. Again, a mask of anarchy, right? What was this anarchy? The anarchy in question is nothing short of modernity, and Anglo-Saxon modernity in particular. The way in which all that is solid melts into air. The way in which all that is holy becomes profane, right? This specific thing we call modernity, which also corresponds to the arrival of general commodity production, where suddenly all relations between people become reduced to this abstract and general form of the commodity. We are talking about literally the same thing. What Marx was talking about in terms of general commodity production, what Hobbes was talking about in his idea of the war of all against all, what Shelley is talking about in the mask of anarchy, what Descartes is talking about in the sphere of knowledge, right, or the sphere of philosophy. And they're basically all referring to the same thing. Anarchism is nothing more than the naked expression of trying to positivize this negation. Turning this negation, again, the negation that corresponds to general commodity production, the vacuum of state power that gives rise to thinkers like Hobbes, and which, corresponds to the political turmoil of Europe, best epitomized by the French Revolution. All of these things represent a negation. They represent the negation of the old feudal ancient regime order, okay? Now, this negation becomes positivized when we say that it is actually a real object. This negation represents the truth of all reality. This negation is itself something we can make a positive object, or in a word that Kantians like to use a lot, the negation becomes reified. Something that basically poses a problem only for our thoughts in our heads, we reify that into some real thing. So that's what I mean by positivize, right? So it represents a positivization of the negation. Now, in the case of anarchism, the entire basis of anarchism, the entire point of anarchism, and we're speaking within the realm of the deeper aesthetic that actually defines it, lies very simply in the reification of the vacuum within state power that emerges after modernity. The object of anarchism is simply the nihil of statehood, the nothingness of statehood. However, only a midwit retard will say that this nothingness of statehood merely represents the absence of the state. No, this nothingness has a presence. The presence being the modernistic, secular, atheistic, whatever you want to call it, basis of state power in the modern age. What is the basis of the state in modernity? It's in a man-made, contrived constitution. It's in some kind of, it's from reason, right? Which was popular during the French Revolution. It's from some kind of artificially contrived thing that cannot draw its legitimacy from anything objective, eternal, yada, yada, yada. If you ask the fucking Aztecs, what is the basis of your state power? They're gonna give you like this grand mythology and this great poetry and this great religious whatever. And if you ask an Ottoman what is the basis of the state power, the Ottomans would call their state, their dawla, they would call it the sublime state. Meaning the state, it literally, in terms of the way we can even cognize it, passes beyond the threshold of the faculties of the understanding, as Kant would put it. It's the definition of the sublime. It relates to us as sublime. This view of statehood, this natural, let's call it, intuitive understanding of the state disappears, as with everything else for that matter, with the arrival of European modernity. The first point in terms of being able to draw a critique of anarchism is to basically exercise ourselves of our own anarchistic bias that we have by default. Where we say, for example, when the ancient Egyptians used to justify their statehood or understand their statehood in religious and mythological terms, this was just a disguise to obscure and mystify brute relations of unequal power between individuals. This is patently wrong. This is what we call vulgar or English materialism. No, when the Egyptians are representing their state in this way, even though it is not necessarily scientific or materialist, they are most definitely not disguising some underlying inequalities or injustices of power. They're not justifying anything. They are giving expression to the form of their being. In a mystified way, yes, but that is the form of their being. The anarchists presume that were it not for these states across history, we would just revert to some natural state, Avatar James Cameron, woo, we're just the animals and plants. And they kind of project this on indigenous tribes and stuff. We would return to nature and we would become net free again. That's not true. As Hegel points out, if this were true, states would not have history. Anarchist retards look at the history of humanity since, let's say, the founding of quote-unquote civilization, since the emergence of private property and the emergence of large-scale whatever. They look at this and they say, these are just new forms of oppression. These are just new forms of the same injustice. And these retards evince their inability to establish the most minimal connection to mankind and their dismissal of the development of spirit, the real historical development of spirit, as all the same. This is a supreme form of gaslighting. It is not all the same. There is real development across history. There is, I'm not saying this in the Whig sense of linear progress, but something is developing. These changes in history do tell us something about our humanity. Our human being, meaning the deeper reality of our humanity, is developing in real time across history. This is the Hegelian view, right? This is the Hegelian view. The anarchist retard looks at that and says, it's all the same, it's all oppression. Even if we granted you it's all oppression, why is it that oppression has a history? Why are there, moreover, this is the better part of putting it, why does there appear to be contradictions within oppression? Why is that? Might that have something to do with the constitutive contradiction that gives rise to your aesthetic, which is namely between the way a state legitimizes itself and the actual material reality of the state? What if that contradiction is not absolute? What if you're generalizing what is actually a relative contradiction of the state itself? We're going to get to that, because as soon as I relate this to fascism, it's going to be so crystal clear to you why Adolf Hitler was the most famous anarchist and most successful anarchist in the history of humanity. Adolf Hitler. None other than Adolf Hitler. Now, for the anarchists, in their conception of the relationship between individuals and states, now, let's talk about the metaphysical basis of anarchism and how it's the same as liberalism. Namely, the thing that unites someone like Hobbes, John Locke, and Proudhon, and God, whoever the fuck else, right? Godwin, whatever you want, Bakunin, the anarchist, is that the individual substance, the material individual, or I should say the empirical individual, is the object somehow of statehood. meaning states are merely derivative of definite relations between individuals. However, these relations between individuals are not themselves material. I'm going to quote to you something from Marx's thesis on Feuerbach. So, what Marx says about all hitherto materialism, the materialism that's the foundation of both liberalism, anarchism, and necessarily by extension fascism, he says, the chief defect of all hitherto existing materialism is that the thing, reality, sensuousness, is conceived only in the form of the object or of contemplation, but not as sensuous human activity, practice, not subjectively. So what is he saying? He's basically saying that this older materialism only conceives objectivity, let's just put it in that way, objectivity or reality in the form of some kind of atom, some kind of one-sided object, some kind of self-enclosed thing. It doesn't actually conceive things like labor, like activity. It doesn't conceive things like material relations between individuals to themselves be material. But intuitively, this is a pretty shocking thing to say. How could relations between individuals be material? We can't measure relations. There's no tangibility of relations. Individuals, after all, are the tangible things in actual reality that we can sense and we can measure and can just be tangible, right? So how could their relations themselves be material? How can material relations and this is, by the way, going to define why Marxism and anarchism are fundamentally incompatible. And we're going to talk about why in the West this has not dawned on people yet. But this is going to define why they are fundamentally incompatible. Marxism and anarchism are fundamentally incompatible because within Marxism, objectivity does not mean a form. Objectivity is not a form. Objectivity is the dialectic unity of form and content. So, what does it mean for relations to themselves be objective? It means this. By the time that we enter the world and can measure it as conscious beings that can cognize things and objects like this water bottle, by the time that I am consciously aware in the world and can cognize this water bottle, it's already too late. I have already been defined materially. My true material cause has already preceded me. But the arrogance of modernity is this assumption that when we cognize an object like a human individual or a water bottle of some kind, we have arrived at the very essence of material reality. But for Marx, this ability to differentiate and make the world intelligible into different objects itself presupposes relations that are material. The scandalous insight of Marx, which is so difficult for Western brains to understand. The Eastern brain understands this very well. Russians, Chinese, Middle East, they all understand this. And I'm not saying before, how are you talking about race stuff? No, I'm saying the mind. I'm not saying for a racial reason. I'm saying for a cultural reason. The Western mind can't comprehend this for the simple reason that the scandal sounds like an absurdity. Marx is basically saying relations between people precede the way in which those relations become apparently tangible to us. You know what that fucking means? It basically means a relation precedes the way that relation actually exists in reality. It means, for example, the relation somehow between capitalist and proletarian somehow has a reality even before there are any capitalists or any proletarians. This sounds like an absurdity, but this is the only meaning of the materiality of a relation. Relations to production can only be material insofar as they somehow possess primacy in relation to their actual existence, to their actuality, and finally, to the way that they are apparently and phenomenally intelligible to us. For Marx, and the reason why for Marx is simple, our labor in relation to nature somehow precedes our consciousness. Now, someone would hear something like that and be like, that's technically not true because all labor presumes a form of consciousness, right? But the reason it's true, according to Marx, is that somehow we are always already doing something in reality before it makes sense to us, or better put, before we can cognize that into any kind of form. And it kind of does make sense if you do believe that we come from the animal kingdom. I mean, animals are just doing shit, right? And yet somehow, they don't need to think about it. They don't need to cognize it. It doesn't need to be conscious. So there has to be some point in the continuity of the transition from animal to man where we inherit this kind of doing that is over and against any kind of consciously cognizable form. And I don't want to veer off too much, but this is something Freud would describe as drives. He would describe this as our drives, right? As our id, our ID, right? But Marx is basically saying the same thing. I mean, he's not saying we get animal instincts from the animal kingdom, but he's just saying that before we are in a world of consciousness and of consciously cognizable forms, we're doing something already. And this is also, I would argue, the dreamlike world of the unconscious. Now, if you ask an Aborigine in Australia what their origin story is, what do they say? They say something pretty interesting, don't they? They say dream time. That in the past, in our ancient history, in our primordial mythological history, we dwelt in something called dream time. So this strange limbo place of dream time, that is the origin of humanity. That is the adobe of material relations that only then later become cognizable as definite forms by our consciousness. So I'm not saying it's neither that, on the one hand, we're animals who have the instinct to do certain kinds of labor, and it's also not, on the other hand, that our labor is premised by consciously cognizable forms of thought. It's somewhere in between this strange dream time, this limbo-like state of the unconscious, where we somehow find ourselves doing things. We can't explain why. We can't ground that in a reason that's cognizable to our thoughts. That doesn't mean our minds aren't actively involved in it. It just means that takes precedence, right? Think about your dreams. Think about when you're sleeping and you literally dream. I mean, something is clearly going on with your mind, right? But as Freud would put it, it's the fulfillment of an unconscious wish, right? It's not really happening according to what you want to happen or what you think should happen or what you're, you can understand there's a difference between dreaming and living in reality, right? So dreaming should give you an idea how consciousness, how the mind, yes, it's an indispensable part of our ability to engage in labor. After all, Marx said that the thing that differentiates man from animal is our ability to raise up the object of labor in our imagination and realize it accordingly. But this should not be taken for some kind of rationalistic consciousness, is my point. This is the fundamental distinction between anarchism and Marxism. Taking it back, right? Taking it back to our original thing. For anarchism and liberalism and fascism and whatever else, the material thing is always already latent with its phenomenal form. So when I'm talking about something that's material, I'm talking about something that already somehow apparently and phenomenally exists just outside of my consciousness, right? It's just like this water bottle. I'll throw this the other side of the room and I know it's there, it's tangible. But the paradox is that I only know that because I saw it first. How do you know something's tangible? How can you know things are real without having always already made them cognizable to your mind, right? Does anything exist outside of your mind? Well, the way Marxism resolves this contradiction, specifically Lenin, is basically that it's a false dichotomy because while our mind plays a vital role into giving form to things in our thoughts, right? The thing, the phenomenal form or the thought of the thing is not actually there. We have to play an active role of doing that. So that means for Marxism, materiality is content. It is the content of the dialectic relation between form and content. It's the content, not the form. Form belongs to the sphere of thought. So for Marxism, materiality means content. It doesn't mean some deeper form. Form is something on the surface. There's no deeper form. Form only becomes form, which is something that has a beginning and end, through consciousness, through thought. Marxism and anarchism are not mutually exclusive. You are fundamentally retarded in your head. You are mentally fucking stupid. I cannot understand how you just listened to what I fucking said and would be so fucking stupid to type that in my chat. How are they not mutually exclusive when for Marxism, objectivity is precedent to form? You know what that fucking means? That means the state is not some arithmetic relation of tangible individuals. It means the materiality of statehood precedes its tangible form. It means the object of statehood, the materiality of statehood, is precedent and primary before its existence and its tangibility. That fucking means that for Marxists, the state is objective, not voluntary, not the result of some oppressive structure, some scam that, oh, I want to oppress you. That's what. No, that's not the basis of the state. For Marxism, the state, again, is derivative of class relations to production. For anarchists, the opposite is true. The state begins from an arbitrary individual elevating themselves over all other individuals, when before there was a state of nature and somehow we were all atomically separated, and it takes a state to basically force us through violence to be in association. And if it wasn't for that state, it would just be based on voluntary communal relations, wholesome communal relations, yada, 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 yada. Either way, you have the same premise. You have the same metaphysical premise of anarchism, whatever form it takes. The state being a result of human social relations is a cornerstone of anarchist critique. Hey, you dumb fuck Chaz, you stupid bitch. What anarchists mean by social relations are tangible relations of power. They do not mean the same thing Marx means, because for Marx, a social relation is antecedent and primary before its phenomenal apparency and even before its existence. You stupid fuck. So when you say social relations, you're referring to a guy with power having power over someone else. It's this like Foucauldian arithmetic where I have more power than you. My power subtracted by your power. It's like this like arithmetic of different agents having different levels of coercive power over one and another. The reason why this means anarchism and Marxism are fundamentally irreconcilable is because Marxism responds to modernity, to the contradiction of modernity that gives rise to anarchism and which is given expression by liberalism. Anarchism is responding to it, liberalism is realizing, right? Basically has to do with the fact that within Marxism, the negation posed by modernity, the negation, is a moment of positive material being. What does that mean? What does that mean? Marx looked at, principally in the form of modern philosophy first, the way in which form, in the form of thought within philosophy, was being raised above and over the whole of reality, basically positioning itself as the form of a negation. I, for example, am Hegel. I am Hegel and I arrive at these mighty insights of thought. But then Hegel's pupils will look at me, and I'm Hegel, remember? And they say, but here's the problem. Your mighty insights of thought are in contradiction with the reality, right? So somehow, as a result of this contradiction posed between the insights of philosophy and the reality before us, we have to say the reality's wrong, the philosophy is correct. And what this does is basically give rise to all of these stupid fucking young Hegelian trends, which Marx spent his time, along with Friedrich Engels, shitting on. Like people like Stirner, who came to the conclusion that, the individual ego is the only real thing. All of the ways that reality is trying to tell us, hey, dumb fuck, you're not just a fucking individual. There's things outside of you. Stirner's like, oh, that's just a spook. Because there's no way for that to be mediated outside of our heads. That means there's nothing. It's like the solipsism, right? The Stirnerite solipsism. You had these other dumb fucks like Bruno Bauer, right? And the rest. Then you finally have Feuerbach, who finally says, okay, there is something beyond thought, and it's humanity. But then even for Marx, he's saying, but your humanity's still an ideal of a humanity that has defied religion and has defied philosophy even. That's still an ideal. That's not even the real one yet, right? Because for Feuerbach, if mankind has not awakened to his true consciousness, and all the worse for mankind, as Marx put it, right? If man does not find his essence in agreement with his existence, so much worse for him. This is like ad verbatim what Marx said in the German Ideology, in his critique of Feuerbach, right? So what Marx does, more or less, is he looks at this general negation posed by modernity to reality, here in the form of philosophy. And he says, while this is real, it is merely a moment of positive being. And for Marx, he names this positive being. He names this positive being as humanity. But in contrast to Feuerbach, Marx names this humanity as the proletariat. Marx says the proletariat is the ingenious soil of the people. So what does that mean, the ingenious soil of the people? Marx, the proletariat is the truth of humanity. Why is the proletariat the truth of humanity for Marx? Because for Marx, the proletariat is the result, the remainder of what humanity is after it has underwent the process of this modernistic, abstract negation. The remainder, this pound of flesh, Shakespearean terms, that remains is the proletariat. It has gone through the process. To quote Marx, it is the complete loss of man in the face of abstract and negative modernity. So it is the class that can only find its salvation in the complete re-winning of man. So why am I telling you all of this? Why am I telling you all of this stuff about the proletariat and yada 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 and philosophy? Because the anarchists respond to that same problem Marx did in a completely different way. The anarchists say there's a contradiction between the abstract negation and some kind of reality. So the anarchists respond to this by saying this negative abstract reality, this impression of the negation onto our consciousness is itself the real thing. That is the object. So for Marx, the proletariat is the object. Why? Because the proletariat is a semblance of positive being, which reconciles the negation. For the anarchist, only the negation is the object. You see how different those two viewpoints are? You see how fundamentally different their implications are? Because for Marx basically he awakens some kind of Eastern modernity where we can reconcile the abstraction of modernity with our particular humanity, not just in terms of the proletarian class, but also in terms of different civilizations, different nations, different peoples, different cultures, different religions, different traditions. All of these things can find some resolution in the aftermath of the way in which modernity wipes them clean. Something positive can reemerge, which reconciles them. But what does the anarchist say? All of those things I just mentioned to you, humanity in all of its determinate expression is just bullshit. It's just negation. It's all a mask of anarchy. Anarchism is the truth. No state. There's a nothingness of statehood. There's a nihil of statehood. This is how anarchists respond to the same problem. Completely different aesthetic. Aesthetic is the most important thing, by the way. It means the deeper sense we have of reality. Yes, it's a denial of the reconciliation. It's what Hegel calls the unhappy consciousness. Now, what is the unhappy consciousness? It basically more or less TLDR. It's when you get stuck in the second term of the dialectic. Have the positive, whatever, affirmation, negation, and then negation of negation is the third thing. Anarchists are stuck in the second. So it is in this sense that I identify anarchism with fascism. Because both anarchism and fascism are stuck in this second term, this unreconciled negation. Now, specifically how that is, I'll explain it. Now, specifically in regards to the state, though, what are the implications? So the first form for Marx, when he discovers the proletariat as the truth of humanity and the true object, the true symptom, as Lacan put it, of the world in which he lived, he basically was admitting to the fact that somehow, all along, this was our cause. This was our true material reality. But this material reality didn't just exist in a self-subsisting way outside of our consciousness. Our consciousness, what was happening within our consciousness, within the development of German idealism, yada, 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 and in all of world history by extension, but specifically within German idealism, this consciousness basically participated in the development of the object in reality. So the object didn't just exist selfishly and by itself as an atom. Our very journey within philosophy and so on is the very development of that object in reality. So what does that mean? What is the basic implication? The basic implication is that for Marx, material reality does not come at the expense of the overt, apparent, and superficial forms, which are nonetheless not reducible to. Rather, form participates actively in its own content. It means there is no anarchic substance of the state, like as Hobbes would put it. The state participates in the development and realizes its own material object in its own superficial and overt form. There's no true form of the state. That's what I'm trying to tell you. The form of the state is the realization of its material object. That is the Marxist view. That is why Marxists can say the absurd thing that relations to production precede materially their phenomenally apparent form. The relation is more true than the apparent form. Why? Because the relation represents the essence of the apparent form. For example, I'm going to teach you a secret. Relation between proletarian and capitalist. Is that relation what goes on the factory floor? No! The relation exists before anything happens on the factory floor. The relation is real and material even before any capitalist hires any proletarian. Now, it's improbable that that would be the case, but essentially speaking, the relation is primary. Why? Because the relation is not referring to some contractual, conscious relation between individuals. It's not referring to a relationship created by individuals. The relation is referring to contradictions within the way our individuality is defined in the first place, particularly in the form, in this case, of the bourgeois state. The bourgeois state, for example, realizes some universal society, some universal community, which every individual is an equal and all are equal before the law, yada, yada, yada. And then we are all citizens, universal subjects of the state, where there's no distinctions in caste or privilege, yada. That alone creates a capitalist relation. How? Moreover, how that arises, we're going to get to that as well. But only from this perspective we can understand relations of production. Why? Because the question is then posed, and I've said this before, our very formal universal equality gives rise to a relation where some sell the produce of labor, while others sell labor itself, labor as such. So you can derive the capitalist relation even before there are any apparent capitalist relations from a deeper material reality. And this reality is unconscious, it's material, and it even precedes the universal form of the state itself. It refers to the definite furthest threshold by which men and women are able to relate to their own universality, not only in the sphere of consciousness, but as such. Based. Thank you, John.
Material relationships exist before we are able to recognize its forms.
Precisely.
Is that what Stirner doesn't realize about the state?
It's part of
Based.
Thank you, Morlock. Appreciate
Is
you.
anarchism the infantile stage before actual idealism?
Yeah, it really is. And we're going to get to that, actually.
Based.
Love from the dive.
How Giovanni Gentili is the most consistent anarchist of all. But anyway, let me continue, okay? So what that means is that anarchists and Marxists, again, to recap, have a very different understanding of what the state is. For anarchists, the state represents the arbitrary power of some individuals over other individuals, which is called society. So for anarchists, the state is the arbitrary power that exists according to the exertion of some wills over other wills. Right? But for Marxism, the state is not an arbitrary elevation of some will over other will. The state, rather, realizes in its form the highest extent to which, on a material level, men and women enter into definite social relation. So for Marx, the state represents something materially objective. Material objectivity being objective relations to production. Relations that are not premised by arbitrary exercise of some wills over other wills, but relations which define the highest threshold by which mankind relates to its own otherness and its own universality. What am I? We can ask this question on a conscious level and shoot the shit with answering. But before we ask the question, what am I am being defined in a way that relates me within what Lacan would call a chain of signifiers that define the relationship I have in material reality to all others. We are not just what we see in the mirror when we look in the mirror. We are also, in a sense, realized in our social whole. Now, in the West, we have to contrive very complicated theories and ideas in order to understand this. But in a country like China, or a country like India, or anywhere outside of Europe, for that matter, that an individual is defined by being a part of a greater social whole is, from a civilizational perspective, it's a given. It's naturally given. It's intuitively given. For them, it's common sense. I have to present to you as a theory, but in Eastern civilization, it's given. An individual is part of a social whole, even if that social whole is not individually tangible. So this is the Marxist view. That is the simple Marxist view. And Marx, the difference between Marx and let's call it Eastern thought, all hitherto Eastern thought, which made sense of man's insertion into the social whole, Marx establishes a science of sociality. What does that mean? In the Eastern society, we naturally and intuitively insert our individuality within the context of a greater social whole. We are a part of something bigger. But that is only cognizable to us through some kind of mystical, mythological, yada 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 type of way, which can easily veer into the territory of superstition. The state has divine origins. As a matter of fact, the state is the realization of divinity on earth. From the oldest civilizations, this is the view, where it doesn't matter geographically, by the way. Marx says no, we cannot make reference to some external thing to make sense of how we are part of a greater social whole. Because the way we are part as individuals of a greater social whole is defined by the material relations to production within that social whole. Now, the production of what? The production of human beings. The production of our means of subsistence, of our way of life. Not just people think economics and they just think, something crude. No, it's our way of life. It's how we subsist, how we enter into some kind of relationship to nature, how we transform nature in a way that reproduces us in some kind of way, that allows us to subsist, that allows us to live. So Marx is different, and this is his Western Enlightenment inheritance. He refuses to superstitiously conceive of sociality and the social whole. He elects to possess a scientific understanding of it. And what that basically means is it's something knowable to us in some kind of way. Now, I'll give you an example of how this is knowable to us. Because a lot of people make the mistake, some interpretations of Marx, like Lukács, right? According to which sociality is knowable to us. Basically, it exposes it fully and nakedly to modern scientific consciousness, yada, yada, yada. This is wrong. Even if something is knowable to us, doesn't mean it's an object of technological domination. Knowability also means possessing the necessary political insight. For example, this type of science of the social whole was an indispensable part of the wisdom of Stalin, for example, to engage in the collectivization of the countryside. Why? Because Stalin understood that these relations to production that permeated the countryside, which are leftover, the Stolypin reforms, were holding back industrialization. So this science of Marxism-Leninism it also has practical implication today in China. They understand in China, for example, that the form of small-scale agriculture is no longer sustainable, but it is socially the foundation and the fabric of Chinese civilization. So its essence must be distilled somehow and must be replaced. And how is it being replaced in the Xi era? It's through the poverty alleviation campaigns and the shift from small-scale agriculture, from being the mainstay of the Chinese economy, of the Chinese people, I should say, to, for example, real estate, small-scale apartments, homes people can own and rely upon. Also, various state benefits, yada, 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 various forms of entitlement to production through the form of the state, securities, yada, yada, yada. So, this specific science discovered by Marx does not nakedly reduce all that is holy and sacred to some kind of illusion. It's still something real, right? It doesn't, in this Philistine way, reduce relations between people to this mechanical, technological relation as the object of modern science. We are able to preserve the, let's just call it, oceanic depth of the way in which we relate to society and to humanity within definite and particular civilizations, with all of the literary and poetic and spiritual implications that come to that. All of this is preserved. It's preserved and even brought to new heights. It's just no longer mystified and obscured, where definite knowledge is called into question. We understand that in order to reproduce our particular human sociality and our social whole, it is necessary to have a science of humanity. Science does not mean reduce to knowledge. It means understand in order to navigate, to make the correct decisions, to make the correct choices as a head of state. There have not been statesmen as brilliant and insightful as those of Xi Jinping, of those as Mao Zedong and Joseph Stalin. These represent a return to true Asiatic statesmanship, which requires a definite kind of science, a definite science of humanity, a definite insight and wisdom, which is only made possible now by Marxism and Marxism-Leninism in particular. So, to recap, the anarchist sees the state as completely meaningless, completely anarchic, representing only the exertion of some arbitrary will over others. Moreover, society is just the sum total of individuals. Now, where does fascism enter into this? Anarchism arises where some kind of stance between the individual on the one hand and society and state on the other hand produces this position of negation. After all, it's that very contradiction that gives rise to anarchism. The state legitimizes itself with law and order and crown and myth. But I'm the anarchist and I know the truth. It's all bullshit. Why is it all bullshit? Because of some kind of contradiction between the way the state justifies itself and the real state, whatever that may so happen to be. The veneer of civilization and statehood and religion and all the ways it justifies itself and the reality. This contradiction defines the aesthetic of anarchy. There's someone else for whom this aesthetic would prove to be definitive. The one in particular I want to draw attention to is none other than Adolf Hitler. Again, the world's most infamous and successful anarchist in the history of humanity. But before we get to Hitler, I want to do a very brief genealogy of fascism, specifically through the most infamous anarchist thinker, Proudhon. Now, everybody knows about Proudhon's anti-Semitism. People usually take the anti-Semitism to be evidence of Proudhon's latent fascism, yada, yada, yada. But why actually was Proudhon a proto-fascist? Proudhon develops basically this view that in regards to his critique of society, right, in general, capitalist society, for him, there's a lot of things people don't know about Proudhon, right? Proudhon, people think, was someone who was trying to basically abolish authority, abolish this or abolish that. But this nihilism in regards to politics, in regards to statehood, actually disguised a pretty nasty, voluntaristic attitude toward how power should be used. So Proudhon was a huge militarist. He was a huge racist and militarist. He glorified, in a way not dissimilar to the Nietzscheans, people like Wagner or the Wagner enthusiasts, the way in which they glorify this kind of mythological, poetic violence that is the foundation of society and state, particularly through war and the way in which wars were glorified in the mythic age, Proudhon was all into that kind of stuff, right? So his nihilism of the state was not actually because he was saying, oh, it's just immorality, yada, yada, yada. He's basically trying to set this up in order to fill the vacuum with some extremely obfuscatory, nihilistic, voluntaristic, and mystical understanding of power. Right is with might on whatever side it is found. If might shifts, it shifts too. If might settles here, here also settles right. As long as victory remains the expression of might, it is infallible. When victory is not the expression of might, it has neither consequence nor result. So this is how he was understanding the war at his time. So that quote, who is that quote from? Is that from Mussolini? Is that from the Italian futurists? No, that's from Proudhon. That's from Pierre. That's from the founder of anarchism. The founder of anarchism said some shit. Sounds like it sounds straight out of the mouth of Himmler or Hitler or some kind of shit, right? Doesn't that sound fascist? It's like ad verbatim what they say. But yeah, Proudhon basically had views about war that were indistinguishable from fascism, okay? I'm going to skip through a lot of shit, but again, the reason why is from the same nihilistic understanding of politics and the state. State isn't based on anything materially real. It's not based on anything objective. It's not based on anything human. It's based on the arbitrary exertion of some wills over other wills. Then furthermore, when you have with the anarchists like Proudhon, is forerunners to the Italian fascist idea of corporatism. Now, corporatism basically refers to this economic notion that the relationship between the civil society and the state will be mediated by corporates. Now, corporates represent these middling institutions between the state and civil society that are economic in nature, that basically provide a supplementary reality and existence to capitalism. Corporates are the solid bonds of the society. So on the one hand, within capitalism, you basically have, I'm going to really come full circle with this, guys, and it's like, we're going to talk about social democracy. It's like, it's going to really make sense. I'm going to really imprint in your mind, irrefutably, like airtight, Hitler was a fucking anarchist, okay? So the idea of a corporate, or the notion of a corporate, is basically this parasitical, mediative, extra layer on top of capitalist relations that already exist, that actually produce things. The corporate basically mediates these relations, appropriates their products, or otherwise oversees the manner by which production occurs. And it's just this extra layer on top of traditional capitalist relations. These are the corporates, right? So Marxists, on the one hand, are perceiving that there are these internal contradictions within capitalism that are giving rise to socialism from capitalism itself. And that Marx's view that when seizing state power through the organ of the state, the essential and strategic means of production are somehow going to be placed under common ownership. And from this will begin overseeing the transition materially from capitalism to socialism, right? It's not that the state is creating socialism through its nationalizations. It's that it is it is unleashing relations of production that are being formed within capitalism itself. So that's the Marxist conception of a new society. Not voluntaristic, it's whatever. Now, Proudhon has a conception where these voluntary associations between producers, industrial and agricultural federations, this federative structure of these different kind of corporate associations will basically establish some form of society, some economic society, without any need for a state, on the one hand, or any need for underlying capitalist relations, on the other hand. Now, Proudhon, in his head, may be thinking that the state is absent and moreover capitalist relations are absent. But this is just the narrowness of his head. In reality, he is basically in thought imagining something that is on top of reality. Because again, just because you decide capitalist relations shouldn't exist voluntarily doesn't mean they don't continue to exist. Just because you decide the state shouldn't exist doesn't mean it doesn't continue to exist in some kind of way, right? So in your head, you can be thinking one thing, but what you actually mean is something entirely different. What Proudhon basically means is like the same thing as fascist corporatism. same thing as fascist corporatism. Because the thing that Proudhon proposes takes for granted the underlying capitalist relations, as well as the state that arises as a result of those relations that would make such a thing possible in the first place. Only in fascism is the ideal actually realized. And before we get there, I want to actually trace this. Right, for you, because before we get to Hitler and the Germans, I'm going to talk about Italian fascism, because this is the history that they somehow want to cover up to us and they somehow want to make us deny, right? There was a group around the early 1900s. First of all, anarchism was never solidly left-wing in any capacity. And when I say left-wing, I mean like progressive. It was always intermixed with the types of reactionary socialism that Marx was describing in the Communist Manifesto. There was no like left or right. There's none of that stuff. There was no, there wasn't this idea of progressivism or anything of that nature. You basically just had, this stance towards society and the status quo of negation. We negate everything. We want to abolish everything, yada, 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 right? So this is the anarchist stance. So just as much as the anarchists today, they try to whitewash and say, we've always been revolutionary leftists who believed in trans rights. Not true. Equal successors of the anarchist tradition, so-called tradition. And by tradition, I'm referring to the patriot. So there's different senses that we're using the word anarchism. On the one hand, we're referring to what anarchism actually means in reality. On the other hand, we're referring to a patriarchal tradition, ideological tradition of thought that begins with Proudhon, right? So in this second sense is what I'm dealing with now. So there was also a right-wing tradition of anarchism, which finds its way into culminating into the Churchill-Proudhon group. Now, the Churchill-Proudhon group basically adopted Proudhon's mutualistic ideas and the syndicalist ideas of the anarchist tradition that we're developing at the time. Because I'm talking about definite traditions here. And it basically created this political group. And their basic idea was that through unions, right, through syndicalism, we're basically going to abolish the state, and we're going to abolish the need to even take state power. We're going to basically create the embryo for a replacement of the current state through syndicates, right? And this will replace the state power. We're going to bring the whole economy to a standstill and, voluntarily and shockingly and immediately replace all of it. Dramatic, revolutionary change, yada, yada, yada. They're also extremely nationalistic, but so is Proudhon, by the way. Another thing that anarchists like to neglect is that the nation is a material reality. So an anarchist consistently has to be a nationalist because there's a reality of a nation not reducible to state. That's why national anarchists believe in we're anarchists, but we're also neo-Nazi racists because races are real and we need to free the racial energy from the state that's keeping it bound, right? So this is another idea that they have. But one of the members of the Churchill-Proudhon would be Georges Valois. And Valois would go on to found something called I don't know how to pronounce it, it's called the Fascism, right? It's modeled after Benito Mussolini's fascism. And this was in the 20s. So this was France. So here was a direct continuity between the social collectivistic Proudhonism and fascism. You're going to say, Haas, that's a one-off. It's not like the syndicalists were a huge force in France. It's not like they were huge in Spain. It's not like the synarchists were a big thing in France as well. All of these things are coincidence, right? Well, on the other hand, you have the individualistic interpretations of Proudhon's ideas. And within these individualistic ideas, which I guess comes from more Stirnerite interpretation of Proudhon, you basically have people who would be formative in the development of Italian fascism, like Massimo Rocca. Now, Massimo Rocca was an anarchist within Italy. He had a friend named Mario Guoda, who was also in league with him, right? And at the outset of World War I, they decided that they were going to be pro-war, right? And there was a very smooth continuity between their anarchism, their anarchistic ideas, and their adoption and formation of Mussolini's fascist party. Also, it's not to mention the influence anarchism posed for the Italian futurists, who would be like this cultural and aesthetic foundation of fascism as well. Fascists like Leandro Arpinati would actually come to prominence having originated as the followers of Rocca. and the anarchist movement. And he became Mussolini's number 2 guy. So it wasn't some one-off case. This is Mussolini's number 2 guy has origins as an anarchist. I'm just talking purely on an intellectual level, just to show you and prove to you the roots of these things, right? More or less, almost all currents of anarchism in Europe at the time culminated in what we call fascism. Fascism was the culmination. It was the evolution. Now, how do you explain that continuity? I'll get to that, right? In works like The Intellectual Origins of Fascism by G.A. Borghese, which was published November 1934 in some social research journal, right? Observers would make the connection very early on, right? For example, they would say things like, fascism takes equitability into account and not contradictorily at all. Both extremes of the post-romantic disintegration, the super-individualistic, anarchic, solipsistic extreme, and the reactionary obscurantist heard like opposite. So even in this journal, they're able to point out how this hyper-anarchistic individualism, on the one hand, this solipsism, and on the other hand, this sheep-like tyranny over the masses, they're perfectly reconcilable and they're unified in fascism, right? They're two sides of the same coin. This is like when I said Hitler was an anarchist, like, how is Hitler an anarchist? I associate Hitler with authoritarianism and violence and all this kind of stuff. Well, that is just the other side to the coin of his whimsical, hyper-individualistic, voluntaristic, and arbitrary notion of what state power is. Continuing. Mussolini, I'm quoting the same journal, Mussolini was an anarchist and an artist, endowed no doubt with an exceptional and exceptionally well-trained ability for handling passions. He shared also the natural inclination that such ability usually carries with it the inclination to prefer passions easier to handle. Why was he describing Mussolini as an anarchist? Because Mussolini, again, had a view of the state that it was the arbitrary exercise of the individual will. So this also comes with it a view of the state where in the exercising of this will, when you're not yet in state power, it's going to position you as an anarchist. You're abolishing the state subjectively in your practice, supposedly, but that also means the most naked and shameless tyranny state. Mussolini did not obey the law and order of his time. He didn't respect the law and order. He didn't respect the state and its traditions and its customs. He was an anarchist. He proceeded according to his own individual will. Now, as a final bonus, before I get into the real analysis of anarchism, I just want to point out the general relationship between ultra-leftism and fascism as well. So, when I was reading the letters, which seemed like they were fabricated, but nonetheless reflected the Nazi views of the Soviet Union, in the German soldiers' writings to their loved ones from the Soviet Union, I want to give you a quote. They were either told that within the borders of the Soviet Union, there was a workers' paradise, the true home of the workers of the world, but when the National Socialist newspapers and books spoke of the social betrayal in the Soviet Union, wait a second, what do you mean social betrayal? Well, what he's referring to is something I think Himmler, I forgot who, talked about it in the late 20s, that in the Soviet Union, there was a social betrayal of the working class. The state usurped power from the workers and sold them out, basically, in favor of the peasants and in favor of industrialization. And the Nazis would peddle the same exact line. Then you have the traitor and guy who would basically form the Italian Social Republic, Niccolo Bombacci, who would basically say things like, Stalin will not create true socialism, Mussolini will. So what do all these things mean, right? Specifically within those contexts. I want to actually emphasize that fascism is a phenomena, like anarchism and all other forms of ultra-leftism, of the urban, lumpen, petty bourgeoisie, or the lumpen proletariat, whatever you want to call it. It's the urban lumpen. It's an ideology of the urban lump. It takes the rationalism, modernism, and metaphysics of classical modernity, which found representation and which found realization in the urban centers of Europe at the time. It takes this as its starting point and its ending point. It begins its campaign for revolutionary overthrow of all society from the urban center. It sets up the urban center as the realization of true universality, whereas all particularity manifesting itself within the countryside, or outside of the metropole in colonies or in the Slavic East represents basically some kind of meaningless subhuman reality, or in the case of the Nazis, some kind of like source of mystical obfuscation, case of like blood and soil and all this mythological bullshitting and so on. So fascism, Nazism, anarchism, Trotskyism, ultra-leftism, and also social democracy within proper context, we are pretty much talking about the same thing. We are talking about the psychosis of classical modernity and of liberalism manifesting itself as the tyranny of the town over the country. These are shared in common. And the sentiment of fascists and Nazis toward the Soviet Union was the same sentiment of Trotskyism, ultra-leftists, and anarchism. Pointing out the hypocrisy of the Bolsheviks and the Soviets. Where they saw hypocrisy, the Soviets were expressing the dialectic wisdom of the immortal science of Marxism-Leninism. Them, it's dialectics. For the retards, it's hypocrisy and it's a contradiction. Notice, for example, there's a guy, many third positionist intellectual LARPers, fascists, one of them's named Zoltanius, they write polemics against me, talking about, there's so many contradictions in your worldview about Stalin being a Marxist. And the arguments are the same thing as what anarchists and ultra-leftists say. Left comms, anarchists, it's all the same thing. It's the same type of consciousness, right? So I want you to keep that in the back of your head. Now, to give you an illustration, an idea of Nazism generally, I want to take us to the anthem of the Nazi Party, which was the Horst Wessel Lied, right? It's the song about Horst Wessel. Horst Wessel was a fucking pervert, a pimp, and some chicken shit guy who started kind of cross-dressing, so to speak, LARPing, because of the thrill of it, right? The 20s in particular. So Horst Wessel, within the 20s, would join all sorts of these kind of right-wing paramilitary groups. And these groups in the Weimar Republic of the 20s were anarchist groups, all intents and purposes. Now, they may not have shared the ideological doctrine of anarchism, but they behaved and acted, positioned themselves to society in the exact same way as like a fucking punk rock anarchist would. In particular, the Viking League, right? So this group, the Viking League, Horst Wessel would say that he joined the Viking League for the adventure of it, for the thrill of it, right? The Viking League was basically these street thugs that would go and just fight people, battle people, and do illegal shit and criminal shit. Think of like Antifa or the Black Bloc or something like that. That's what we're dealing with, right? The Viking League. They had a right-wing flavor to it, but the flavor doesn't matter if it's literally the same thing. Anarchists, right? So it's the same adventurism and voluntarism and anarchism. And then later, the SA would play the exact same role for people like Horst Wessel, who are these lumpen scum of society who wanted to exercise their criminal antisocial behavior in some kind of way. So they would join the SA. They would join these terrorist groups. They would join these adventuristic, perverse groups that would allow them to realize they wanted. So the rank and file of fascism historically was the same as anarchism, right? Now, if you remember what I said just on the economic level about how Proudhon intellectually laid the foundations for fascist corporatism, you have a clear pattern we're witnessing, right? Fascism seems to be some kind of supplementary excess to liberal bourgeois society. It does not actually engage in a root and stem revolutionary transformation of the state. There's a profound level of continuity between the bourgeois state and the fascist state. The main thing different with fascism is that fascism is an excess over and above it. It's this extra thing on top. In political terms, the extra thing is political dictatorship, the use of police, paramilitary, extra-legal, dictatorial, and emergency powers in order to arbitrarily engage in this obscene criminal terrorism against society. In economic terms, it manifests itself in the form of corporatism. Corporatism having its origins in anarchist syndicalism, in anarcho-syndicalism. So what is this excess we're dealing with? What gives rise to this excess? It's the same thing that gives rise to anarchism. The excess in question is the internal contradictions within the liberal bourgeois state. These contradictions basically are between the form of the universal liberal state within classical modernity and its real origins, its reality, its actual existence. This contradiction is the object of both fascist and anarchistic aesthetics. It's just that they cope about it in different ways. Anarchists pretend that they're saying, we need to abolish the state. Anarchists say, yes, you're right about the state, and this is why we do need to abolish the state, the liberal bourgeois state. But the abolition means something that the anarchists of today don't quite understand. Abolition of the state means fully exercise this excess dictatorial power, this obscene criminal supplement of state power, nakedly, shamelessly, and brutally out in the open, this arbitrary exercise of pure political power, criminally, right? With no regard for its legality, no regard for its grounding in civil society, no regard for its grounding in any definite institution, no regard for any historical tradition. This excess is the object of both anarchism and fascism alike. Fascists also abolish the state. They just abolish it in a way the anarchists couldn't even dream of. Because when the fascist abolishes the state, they abolish the form of the state. Namely, the form that guarantees the minimum of the civil liberties that allow the state to have the minimum of some kind of grounding in some human civil society reality. The fascists abolish this, they suspend this, and all that remains at the very top is this criminal excess, which they exercise over the whole of society. Anarchists literally do the same thing. The reason fascists and anarchists appear different is because fascists are just anarchists at the reins of state power. They abolish the state, and for all intents and purposes, they suspend the law, they suspend the state, and engage in this anarchic exercise of power. Anarchists may say, oh, Hitler wasn't an anarchist, Mussolini wasn't an anarchist, but that's just because they're not at the reins of power. If you put any one of these fucking anarchists from the book fair at the reins of power, they will be Hitler. Hitler doesn't mean strict traditional order. Hitler means we're going to suspend any strict tradition, we're going to suspend any real order, and replace it with the criminal, anarchic power of the open dictatorship, as they would put it, of the will, of the individual will. So you see, you should start to begin to get an idea of what I actually mean when I say Hitler was an anarchist. Hitler was an anarchist because he disguised what was actually the criminal excess of the bourgeois state itself with some kind of revolutionary overthrow and abolition. Both the anarchists and the fascists think that they're abolishing the state. And from the fascist perspective, they're abolishing bourgeois liberal democracy. From the anarchist perspective, they're abolishing the state as such. The difference is not important because when anarchists say the state as such, they're setting up a false generality. What they mean in actual reality is the state that actually fucking exists, which is the bourgeois state. You can't speak for all states for all time and all realities. It's definite particular states that you can actually relate to. Otherwise, you're setting up a fake abstraction. Fascists claim that they're ushering in a new order. Anarchists also claim they're engaging in this revolution. But all they're doing is giving expression the criminally constitutive violence of state power in class society, and in bourgeois society in particular. The bourgeois state pretends to be based in the form of the law, the rule of the law, the universal equality of the citizen before the rule of the law and the republic. But in reality, the criminal excess constitutive of this state rears its head when the form of the law enters into contradiction with the content of the people over which it exercises power, specifically in the form of the proletariat, which Marx said was the object of all reality and of thought, the truth of reality. And it's not that the human content is too much and too wealthy for the state to account for as an abstraction. It's just that the actual reality of the people realizes the objectivity of the state in a way that the state cannot account for formally. It is this contradiction between form and content that is the object of anarchism and fascism alike. Both of them respond to this by saying the contradiction between the form of the state and the reality of the state basically means that the reality of the state is reducible to the negation of these forms. Fascism negates these forms through its brutal, open, dictatorial exercise of power. Anarchists try to negate these forms through illegal, criminal, whatever lumpen bullshit activity. But they are one and the same thing. They are one and the same thing. One is at the reins of power. The other is just a generality expressed wherever. Anarchists, fascists, Nazis are the hired thugs of the bourgeoisie. The bourgeoisie needs to address this contradiction in some kind of way. It cannot do so without imperiling its own class through a new social revolution and a new revolution in the forces of production, which will render superfluous the rule of the monopolists. So what does the bourgeoisie do? They put men in masks like the Klan, like the Black Legion in the 30s, like the Nazis, like the SA, and like anarchists and like Antifa and like Black Bloc to do their dirty fucking work that cannot be accounted for by the overt and legal forms of the state. And they mobilize this criminal element in order to dispense with the working class. Because for the bourgeoisie, the proletariat is the ultimate criminal existence. And why do they condemn the proletariat as criminal? They condemn the proletariat as criminal because the proletariat, in its actual reality, cannot be assailed by its empty, negative form. It demands particularity. It demands a particular state. It demands a civilizational state. It demands a people state that reflects the character of the people, that reflects the character of the civilization, that reflects back to them their real substantive history and real substantive reality. That's the criminal crime of the proletariat in the eyes of the bourgeoisie. So in order to dispense with this ultimate crime, the bourgeoisie employs these criminal lumpen scum, even though the proletariat are in the light of day. They're in the light of day before the whole people, playing by the book. The bourgeoisie employs this lumpen criminal element in order to safeguard its parasitical and monopoly power. Anarchists, Nazis, fascists, they're all the same fucking thing. They are all the same fucking thing. Yup. The financial aristocracy is nothing but the rebirth of the lumpen proletariat at the heights of bourgeois society. Absolutely. The lumpen is key here. Because what is the lumpen? The lumpen is the realized criminality, the realized contradiction, and realized psychosis and madness and breakdown of the bourgeois order, of the capitalist bourgeois liberal order. The lumpen scum, these disgusting scum, these dregs, realize the madness of bourgeois society, these degenerate scum, and terrorize the good people, terrorize the working class, and terrorize the proletariat who want to go on with some semblance of humanity, some semblance of normality, and yes, some semblance of real order. Real order which both fascists and anarchists oppose. Yes, exactly. Criminal mercenaries for the bourgeoisie, the lumpen scum that were employed by the CIA and the State Department and the Department of Defense during the Cold War to go to these African countries, to go to Latin America. They're all criminal lumpen scum who are mercenaries of the parasitical imperialist monopoly bourgeoisie. The hero of the anarchist, the hero of the fascist. Hitler was an anarchist. Hitler didn't represent some authentic tradition of German statehood. Stalin pointed this out. He didn't reflect some true patriarchal tradition of the German state. There's no continuity between any German monarchy and Hitler. He came from fucking nowhere. The expression and triumph of the pure will. And represented the anarchic criminal excess of the bourgeois state. Yeah, just like Confessions of an Economic Hitman by Smedley Butler. Yep, the free cops also engaged in anarchistic violence. But the retard midwit comes to me and he says, Hans, Hitler didn't overtly subscribe to the doctrine. There's no doctrine of anarchism. It's a fucking cultural trend. And I'll prove it to you. What the fuck is anarchism, ladies and gentlemen, in the most contemporary sense? It's punk rock. It's the punk rock subculture. What is the punk rock subculture? It's a lumpen subculture where both anarchists and neo-Nazis, same thing. For the same reasons. For the same rebellion against society. We're going to adopt the swastika, the most offensive thing ever. Same punk rock shit. It's a soft power Anglo-American export. But let me actually explain to you, before we do that, the final nail into the coffin of historical anarchism. Because on the one hand, you have fascism in Italy and Germany, which by its lineage comes from syndicalism. From Italy, and then the influence from the Italians onto the Germans and their fascist corporatism, yada, yada, yada. Culmination of anarchism. You also have what's going on in Spain. What about Spain? Spain. The final nail in the coffin of the so-called patriarchal tradition of anarchy. Now, after Spain, I want to make it clear. Any patriarchal tradition of anarchism dies. It's over. There's no anarchism. It's not a real fucking thing. It's not like Marxism, Leninism that has an actual reality in China and Cuba and elsewhere. It's just some stupid bullshit completely made up. Not a real tradition after Spain, but it culminates in Spain. I'm going to actually explain to you why that is. So in the formation of the first International Working Men's Association in the 19th century, Bakunin and his faction basically established an anarchist tradition in Spain. And this basically reached its zenith, its culmination in the CNT-FAI, the anarcho-syndicalists Spain. And it was a pretty big movement among the lumpen scum and also among the privileged proletarian, urban proletariat of Spain's cities, where it reached its zenith. So when Franco couped the Spanish government in 36, there began a Spanish civil war. And the reason why anarchists are considered fellow leftists is because they fought alongside the Communist and Popular Front government for a time against Franco. So for once in history, the anarchists were fighting fascists instead of joining them like they did in Italy and like they did in Germany. So this is what has given rise to the impression that anarchism is anti-fascist. It's because of Spain. But actually, the reason why the syndicalists were opposing Franco was entirely different from the reason why the Popular Front was opposing Franco. The anarchists didn't like the way in which Franco was drawing from backward peasants in the countryside, reactionary ones, and disprivileging the role of the Spanish city. So the anarchists, alongside the Trotskyists, were trying to preserve the tyranny of the town over the country, which Franco was also doing inadvertently. It's just that Franco was forced to make compromises, right? So this is the origin of the anarchist resistance against Franco, more or less. It's not that the anarchists were particularly engaged in any kind of anti-fascist revolution. They didn't care about Franco. They were more so concerned about the anarcho-syndicalists versus the Spanish fascists, the Falange, right? That was an inter-fascist civil war, right? Communists have fought each other, the Sino-Soviet split and elsewhere. So this was also an inter-fascist dispute between the syndicalists and the Phalangists. Both pretty much had the same class background and subjective stance and, attitude and aesthetic and whatever. Very similar beliefs as well. It's just that the anarchists had been engaged in this attempt to carry out a revolution, syndicalist revolution and overthrow of the Spanish state. And they didn't really see a distinction between Franco and the Popular Front, Democratic Spain. They didn't see a distinction between those beyond the temporary alliance. They saw them as the same thing, right? So that's something important to keep in mind. They pretty much saw them as the same thing. So there's a big myth that the anarchists were part of the anti-fascist resistance. They weren't. Their beef with Franco and their beef with the Falange was an inter-anarchist, inter-fascist dispute. Now, Franco wasn't really an anarchist. He wasn't even, I don't know if he was a full-on fascist like Mussolini was. You call him one, I guess. He was a military dictator, right? But he wasn't a Phalangist. And the Phalange was the, Spanish fascists, right? So the Popular Front made so much concessions to these anarchists, these syndicalists, right? They made so much concessions to them. But eventually, communists were becoming increasingly prominent in that Popular Front government, that Popular Front in general. Communists were starting to become very prominent. And there was a few people who didn't like this. Now, who were the people that were upset by the rise in popularity of the communists in the Popular Front government? Liberals, Freemasons, right? Freemason, liberal, globalist, scary whatevers, and anarchists. The CNT, alongside these liberals like Casado, together conspired to hatch a plan to coup the Popular Front government of Negrin, I forgot his name, Negrin, whatever his name is, to coup that government in order to stop the communist threat. Now, what did they both have in common? Both represented the urban, lumpen, and financial capitalist class globally and the bourgeoisie, yada, yada, yada. They both represented this, and the communist prominence in the Popular Front government was increasingly allowing it to become actually popular, empowering the Spanish peasant, the Spanish popular majority. The urbanoids didn't fucking like that. So they couped the Popular Front government in 1939 in order to negotiate terms of peace and surrender with Franco. These anarchist pieces of shit thought that Stalinism was more of a threat than Franco. They literally couped the Popular Front government in a fascist coup, no different from Mussolini's March on Rome, no different from the fascist coup in Germany in terms of just this naked overthrow of a fucking democratic government in order to make peace with Franco, which failed, by the way. Let me tell you the truth. Just for that alone, and that ended the anarchist tradition. That was the final nail in the coffin to anarchism as a tradition. It was done after that. But that alone should have earned anarchism the reputation, the same reputation as Nazism historically. We should have spit in these fucking people's faces. We should have considered them our enemies. We should have same thing as neo-Nazis. Same exact fucking thing. They should have been disgraced forever. I mean, the October Revolution already did that because these scum tried to destroy the early Soviet Republic and opposed the proletariat of the Soviet Union and the democratic dictatorship of the proletariat and the peasantry as these wreckers and saboteurs working on behalf of the Western imperialists to undermine the Soviet Union. But if that wasn't enough, and if it wasn't enough that they joined the ranks of Mussolini and the fascist party in Italy, if all of that wasn't enough, they couped the Popular Front government and opened the doors for Franco. That should have killed the whole thing. Why didn't it? Why didn't it? We're going to talk about the Cold War now. Anarchism is dead at this point. Nobody gives a fuck about it. It's dead. It's meaningless. It's garbage. Hui aleikum, spit on its grave. The last anarchist, Adolf Hitler, shot himself in a bunker, and the peoples of Europe declared victory over this blight of Nazism, this blight of the madness of traditional and classical modernity that culminated in fascism, anarchism, yada, yada, yada. They defeated it, they stamped their feet on it, and it was gone forever. So we thought. During the Cold War, the Soviets became very popular among the intellectuals of the West. During World War II, I mean. And in the immediate aftermath of the Cold War, something changed. Expectations of the Soviet Union as a workers' paradise and a dreamland were shattered with, on the one hand, huge concentrated effort, Cold War anti-communist propaganda coming from CIA and the rest, and American soft power. And on the other hand, people like Solzhenitsyn, Hungary in 1956, and so on. So all these intellectuals who were Marxists because they're, the Soviet Union is the land of the future, they started to become dissidents to the communist project. These dissidents to the communist project, people like Jean-Paul Sartre, right? They started to cope and say, well, you know what? In history, maybe Marx made a mistake because I see here that Marx was arguing with these anarchists. Maybe the anarchists were right. So in this way, they revived anarchism purely as this intellectual tradition, which was dead at the time. They revived it as this way of coping with the disappointment the Soviet Union was for them. And it was basically solely defined by anti-Stalinism, right? The Soviet Union was such a scary, scary place, disappointing place. We need to get to the true liberation, the true emancipation. That's anarchism, right? So this is being propped up by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. It's being propped up by the deep state. It's being propped up by the, imperialists during the Cold War in the West. Again, as a way to give expression to the dissident movement within global communism, specifically within the West. Now, this also culminates in May 1968, right? Counterculture and all that stuff, where there's this rebellion. A lot of people think that counterculture was about rebelling against the state. No, it was about rebelling against the communist parties at the time, at least within France in 68. French Communist Party was seen alongside the de Gaulle government as the enemy, right, of the students in France in 1968. So anarchism was a way they gave expression to this dissatisfaction. But actually, one of the causes of May 68, and by consequence the adoption of this anarchistic ideology, was the rise of American soft power and the rise of Americanism. Now, America had this British invasion, cultural invasion with the Beatles, the rest, which produced the American hippie counterculture. This was starting to spread around the whole world. So by 68, the French youth and the French students are starting to become infected and infatuated with Americanism and American culture, right? As this way of basically opposing all cultural patriarchs, all traditional cultural patriarchal authorities. It's this new libidinalization of culture that was a consequence of the Americanized mass pop culture, right? So you don't know this, but people think France in 68 was this huge, beautiful revolutionary thing, but Charles de Gaulle was seen as an anti-American. He was resisting America. He was resisting America's new global world order. And the rebellion against him in May 68 was like this implicit, extremely pro-American stance and sentiment. Now you could say, well, what about its attitude to the Vietnam War, Haas? Wasn't that anti-American? Yes, but the resistance to the Vietnam War was also the expression of the American counterculture itself. So you can't really say it's anti-American when this is something going on internal to America and within America, right? Yes, de Gaulle was an anti-Atlanticist, right? So anarchism shifts from being this dead tradition that culminates continental European fascism to this expression of Anglo-American kind of post-modernity or modernity, whatever you want to call it. High modernity, post-modernity, whatever you want to call it. Anarchism basically comes to be the political ideological form of American globalism that is taking shape in the post-war period, according to which you have this post-Oedipal relation to the state, to the nation state, to cultural traditions, and to state socialistic culture, whether it's the welfare state of Europe or it's the state socialism of Czechoslovakia during the Prague Spring, and yada, yada, yada. Now, why? Why is this happening? It's this new way culture is not only being manufactured, but mass culture in particular is starting to become libidinally anarchic itself. The ways in which we enjoy music and enjoy things in general is starting to become too much for the old patriarchal and Oedipal forms of culture to absorb. We're all rocking out to the Beatles and we're all high on drugs, naked and doing whatever. This kind of unleashing of libidinal energies is too much for the old patriarchal order to handle. Now, from a psychoanalytic or Freudian perspective, patriarchal orders are basically ways of domesticating. They're ways of regulating enjoyment to make sure there's like balance and there's some kind of harmony, some kind of like order, right? But with the American era of mass culture and this new cultural turn, you have this intense unleashing of what they call in Lacan's psychoanalysis jouissance or enjoyment, right? You have this unleashing of jouissance and unleashing of enjoyment that goes beyond the threshold of what can be tamed by the traditional society. So this is part of American globalism. This is part of the American cultural turn, and it's part of American soft power. And the way in which that gets translated in political ideological terms for these young people at the time is anarchism. Now they dress it up in some kind of patriarchal tradition. Oh, this is going back to Proudhon and Stirner and these intellectuals. That has nothing to do with it, right? They're just importing that to give expression to this more fundamental rejection of the political state in favor of a more libidinally proximate idea of pure anarchy, man, let's go, rock out, punk rock, whatever, right? It's this it's basically consumerism. It's this excessive consumeristic enjoyment. Let me put it this way, right? Today, in 2022, isn't our state a little outdated for the young people? I mean, I know Hillary Clinton, she's like, Pokemon, go to the polls, and our politicians are silly and they're out of touch. But also, that also represents the way in which the state is no longer sexy. It's not sexy to us. State isn't sexy. Compare the lofty veneer of the authority of the state to an Ariana Grande concert. Ariana Grande commands true devotion. Why does she command devotion? She's proximate. She's immediate. Right there. She's real. The state is far away and it's lying to us. I don't trust the government, man. I don't trust them. They're lying about everything. We're not in a democracy. All of their promises turned out to be false. All of their promises are not real. But this punk rock band, man, this is real. This is real. Because it's aesthetical. because it's beautiful. It's not formal anymore, it's beauty, right? Now, this breakdown of the state's authority. Also, it's not just in America, the founding fathers owned slaves! We were founded by white slave owning landowners! We killed the Indians! It's not just that. It's also in terms of what happened during the fall of communism. Lenin lied! It's all a lie! We're not in true communism! It's the same thing. It's literally the exact same aesthetic that's developing historically. It's the same exact thing, okay? It's the exact same thing going on during the Prague Spring in 68 and with the exposing of the whatever, right? So in political ideological terms, there's something that arrives here that's the same thing as what Hobbes was dealing with. But Hobbes was dealing with the state. What we're dealing with now is something psychological and libidinal, right? But it's the same formation. What is it? It's a vacuum. Traditional ways in which states are able to legitimize themselves at the level of phenomenal reality, the level of our subjective consciousness, the level of our language, the level of our aesthetic, and at the level of our psychological reality broke down. States cannot legitimize themselves in ways that are compatible with the American cultural turn. So these are the contemporary origins of what are called anarchism. It's the same thing as the original origin of anarchism, except it's transposed from the sphere of these impersonal relations of the state to these psychological and libidinal relations of culture. So that is anarchism today. It's not some doctrine of ideas. It's not Proudhon. It's a completely different historical context. And fascism today bears the same relation to anarchism as it did before. It's the same thing. Azov in Ukraine, when they were in Maidan, what were they saying? Russian Soviet communism is bullshit! Decommunization now! Bring down Lenin statues! It was all a lie! Punk rock, rock out! Lady Gaga supports us! YouTube and Bono supports us! We're rocking out! We're true enlightened Europeans on Reddit and playing video games! But this is Azov. Azov is the same subject. Azov is the same subject as this. Azov is not some ancient patriarchal military order of like, we are the defenders of Ukraine. No, it's the same anarchistic, globalized American subject. Same thing. Why does it culminate into Azov? Because the realization becomes increasingly clear that at the same time that you experience this negation, you also experience a semblance of purity and subjective abstraction. A Ukrainian anarchist has to be an Azovite. They have to translate this pure empty vacuum into some apparently determinate form of Ukraine and Ukraine's history and the white race and whatever else in order to safeguard the purity of this negation from the orcs and the hordes to the east, which will commit the unspeakable error of filling this empty form, this pure empty form, some semblance of content. Azov is a protective barrier between the Reddit consumerist subject and a real telluric civilization, a true patriarchal authority worthy of our era, which is what Russia represents. Russia represents a true determination of postmodern universality, a true revival of patriarchal authority. To save themselves from this, they must become Azov. By the way, in the same way, the German lumpen, the German urbanoid, had to save themselves from the patriarchal authority posed by Russian communism. Stalin in particular, in the form of Hitler. Hitler was their Azov, and Stalin was their Putin. I want you guys to understand that communistic violence, Marxist understanding of this violence, it's not adventuristic, it's not voluntaristic. That violence comes from them. Ours is self-defensive. We don't impose this anarchy. They impose it. We just respond. We don't go out of our way to negate. We respond to the negation. Nicholas, you said something really stupid. You said the big other is empty. Why are you? This is just Stirnerism. It's a Stirnerism with a Žižekian twist. Oh, the big other means that it's all fake and illusory. No, the big other is how we psychologically relate to something that is actually real. It does actually exist. When Lacan says there is no big other, he's not talking about existence. Sorry, it's the opposite. He's not saying there's nothing there. He's saying it does not exist, as in the form doesn't exist somewhere. But patriarchal authority is precisely not a form. Yes, it's a name of the big other. Yes, it's the name of the Father. It's more than the big other. It is literally the master signifier, the name of the Father. It is the universal insofar as it assumes particularity, specific particularity. The big other as it arises from the real. The way it arises from the real is not a discrete form. It's not an imaginary form. It's a signifier. Signifiers are not forms. Signifiers are a deeper, just like in Eastern mysticism, the Tao, the Tao. The Tao is not a form, it's a way. The form is only a symptom of the Tao. So it's like it opens up a lot of questions about culture, right? For example, how do we deal with, can we be reactionaries and just return to the older form of culture? Well, it's the same as Marxism, actually. There is a world historical progressive achievement of American mass culture, which the Soviet Union was pretty blind to. But moreover, this is what I want to get to, right? When you think about why ideologies like anarchism are so popular, I want you to also think about what could our attitude be toward American cultural globalism? Because you can't just replace it with your own special older culture. The Soviets failed at this. And here's how they failed. The Soviet Union by the 60s and 70s especially, it's basically the tyranny of your teacher at school. So I know most of you went to school who you live in America. You went to public school, right? Isn't there this weird contradiction between like what the youth considers cool and true and real, and then the teacher kind of just basically trying to cope on this purely institutional level? And is there nothing more pathetic than when the teacher tries to enact a compromise and be like, all right, guys, and I whip and shenane. 2 + 2 = whatever, right? And they try to do that. Or when a politician does it. Anything that represents the old 20th century state institutions. There's something fundamentally incompatible between these and the objects of our cultural enjoyment, right? Where our aesthetic today is defined by the transcendence of beauty. So Ariana Grande is true. Your teacher teaching you math is like stupid, whatever. I'm just going through this just to get a job. I don't care about any of this, right? Interestingly, China found a way to overcome this, and it did so during its Cultural Revolution, precisely when it isolated itself entirely from all foreign culture in general, created its own pure revolutionary culture. In the course of this, China discovered a sharp distinction between the material reality of the state and that of culture. And so China has proven to be the most efficient in being able to cope with globalized American culture, which is basically to deculturalize the state. The institutions of the state don't try to be cool. They don't try to be hip. They confine themselves to their actual material function. And in this way, culture can flourish in the most raw and authentic way, and people can also possess a respect for the institutions of the state. So somehow they're made compatible in China, where they aren't in the United States, elsewhere. But the Chinese way is spreading, right? It's spread to Russia. So this is how anarchism is the foremost enemy of anti-imperialists. If you believe in multipolarity, when I say believe it, I mean like you recognize this new era that's emerging, the ultimate expression of American ideology today is anarchism. Why? Because before, anarchism was just trying to cope with the deficient aesthetic of Soviet Marxism-Leninism. But in this dark Maoist age of Chinese Marxism-Leninism and the rise of post-globalist aesthetics, not pre-globalist, post-globalist aesthetics, multipolar aesthetics, this stance of the unhappy consciousness is being reconciled. And so we see and witness the re-emergence of cultures and civilization that's also hip and cool somehow among the youth. Ariana Grande is not going to cause a counterculture in China. The counterculture is superfluous in China. Oh, you got good music, you got good artists, who cares? Communism is a deeper unconscious reality than all of that. You go to China and you say, it's all a lie! The CCP is all a lie! Communism! They're going to laugh at you. You know what they're going to say? They're going to say, I remember we did that dumb shit during the Cultural Revolution. Good thing we put an end to that. Good thing we matured from that. Good thing we came to a recognition and an appreciation for the fact the truth of our ruling ideology is not phenomenally immediate to us. It's an unconscious reality that goes deeper. It goes deeper, and it's what do you call it? It's not just skin deep, right? They'll laugh at you. Same thing in Russia. No, Russia's alive! And they'll be like, no, we did go through the 90s, in that crazy 90s, that wild west of the 90s of a pure American culture. We're over it. See, the Chinese and Russians, they're not fazed by your video games. They're not fazed by your Reddit. They're not fazed by your soft power culture. They're not fazed by your Ariana Grande or your music or your hip hop or any of that. It's not subversive. The thing that they're actually concerned about is your Hitlerite political correctness, where you're trying to impose these new rules on culture and discourse, which anarchists are leading the way in the United States, by the way, with political correctness. It's political correctness they have a problem with. It's the opposite, right? They don't like this way in which American culture, being unable to ground itself in any real civilizational reality, is starting to become a Hobbesian Leviathan, where Logo was talking about this earlier, where he's like, you know, I read this fan fiction for some reason where like, there's a whole forum where everyone's arguing about Harry Potter, and they're like, can Harry Potter be a black woman? Can Harry Potter be trans? And they're all arguing about like fan fiction for Harry Potter. And then you realize what's going on. They're creating the Leviathan of American globalist culture. First, you senselessly enjoy Harry Potter, but then you take this senseless enjoyment to be the ultimate object. Anarchism, right? Harry Potter has subverted the world, so we're going to take this, or this is kind of like with music. Like, let's say we senselessly listen and dance to this music, and it somehow negates some old Oedipal patriarchal authority, and then that's fine. But then we go, okay, that is the only real thing, that negation. So that's anarchism, right? But then something else happens after that. Okay, that's the only real thing. Now begins the negotiation. What is it? What is its content? How can we deal with it? How can we dwell within it? What is it? And then you have these music subculture that are like, you're not a true fan of the Beatles. Name their albums, name their this, name their that. And it becomes a question of knowledge, right? The university discourse. That's the whole thing. That's all punk rock is, by the way. The whole of punk rock subculture is this gatekeeping bullshit. And actually, punk emerges because the hippie kind of senseless enjoyments of the counterculture need to somehow now be disciplined. They need to be disciplined because we need to know our shit, right? We need to know our shit because we've elevated this counterculture, this countercultural aesthetic to be like the religious absolute. So we've got to create laws and regulate it somehow because it's the truth. It's the only real thing. There's naturally going to be contradictions and disagreements which arise out of that. So that's how punk rock subculture emerges. And that's how you go from senseless enjoyment to this gatekeeping. But punk rock is in front. You go from senseless enjoyment, whatever. Then punk rock introduces gatekeeping. Why does it introduce gatekeeping? Because the senseless enjoyment becomes sublimated into the ultimate object that's replacing the authority of the state. It's replacing the authority of older ideologies and institutions, which is basically anarchism. Now, how does it happen that at the same time that this is anarchist, it's also neo-Nazi? Because the gatekeeping has more implications than just recognizing anarchy in the UK. It also manifests itself in the form of, oh, well, now we also need to recognize the fact we have a lot of cultural and racial premises that our subculture assumes, which is what? The white race, middle class white kids in the urban cities. It's not really a big leap to go from the gatekeeping of punk to neo-Nazism, is it? If you just see some fucking guy from Pakistan in the UK, he doesn't know shit about your dumbass enjoyments or anything like that. So you've got to gatekeep. We've got to gatekeep our society. We've got to gatekeep our communities from these outsiders who don't understand the truth that the state needs to be abolished. Yeah, we believe in abolish everything, even races, even nations. But that Pakistani guy, he doesn't get it. He's a Muslim. He worships something. He has an ethnic character of some kind. We've already abolished everything, but it seems like all of us who've abolished everything, we're white. We're white-skinned. We're racially pure. Our racial white purity represents the purity of our negation, surely. So that's how they become wearing swastikas and skinheads and neo-Nazis, all that shit. It all comes from the same thing. You begin from anarchism, and anarchism is the clay. And out of this nihilistic clay, you make a swastika. That is always going to be the fate of anarchism. Always. it's going to be that swastika. You begin with the clay. Out of that clay, you make a swastika. You have to make that swastika. Anarchism to Nazism. You notice how long this stream is? And I'm just talking. There's so much to exhaust here. There's so much to talk about. There's so much to talk about. We didn't even get to breadtube or any of that shit, right? But I just want to talk about anarchism as a politically correct tradition, because the gatekeeping mostly culminates in the political correctness. Most punk rock thing of all. It's leftism, the Baizwool, Western Baizwool, which is what it culminates in. You start to see something weird going on in the West, which is, why is it that the ideology of the anarchism seems to be the most pure and distilled form of what corporate America believes, of what the ruling elites believe, of what the ruling institutions believe? The reason is pretty simple. All of those institutions are derivative from the same anarchist metaphysics, according to which all cultural realities and determinate realities of the people, all of the histories of people, all of the patriarchal traditions of state and civilization, yada, 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 are meaningless. Empty, abstract, and meaningless. This is biocapitalism 101. All that is solid melts into air, yada, yada, yada. But it's taken a cultural turn, right? Which is what we're talking about here. So the anarchists have become the most pure and undistilled form of the ideology of the class. It's not an ideology it's convenient to have out in the open, but then again, neither is fascism. It's not sustainable for the preservation of order. So what needs to happen is, I'm going to explain it to you like this. Nazism, neo-Nazism, I should call it. Neo-Nazism is anarchism plus the national question. Plus the national question. As soon as we're confronted with those Russians and those Chinese, those Muslims, as soon as we're confronted with those people, all these anarchists are going to reveal their Nazi, neo-Nazi ways. Because you have to understand, anarchism at this point has become a very delicate and methodical tradition of, like, if you misgender someone, you're getting beheaded, right? Become like that. China, Russia, and other cultures who don't give a fuck about any of that, there has to be a way to gatekeep our civilization from those people. Because this is what they have made civilization into. They've turned civilization into a form of pure abstractionism and pure discursive abstractionism, political correct gatekeeping, and the gatekeeping of what is nihil, nothingness, right? Well, that civilization needs to be protected. That's the purity of the white race that they talk about. That's what needs to be protected. Purity of their negative reflexivity. What is the LGBT flag, everyone? It's all colors. It's the universal all colors. All colors in the LGBT flag. White, the color that reflects all colors. Same flag, same thing. That's the LGBT. Now, everything I'm telling you I would have been considered a fucking madman 10, 20 years ago. Look around you guys, motherfuckers. They're literally admitting it. They're literally pro-NATO. Oh, out in the open. They're literally in the Azov battalion. They literally joined the Azov battalion, these anarchists. They're literally pro-NATO. They literally repeat propaganda against Russia and China that comes from the State Department. They're literally talking about decolonized Xinjiang and Tibet. Is this a stretch, what I'm saying? I think I'm just making sense of something that we otherwise thought was really contradictory. But when you fucking think about it, Bosch's anarcho-Bidenism and his combination of anarchism and NATO, there's nothing contradictory about it whatsoever. It makes perfect sense. After the lecture I just gave you, it makes perfect sense. No, it's not just fucking Twitter. Because they're literally in the Azov battalion. They joined them in Ukraine. That's not on Twitter. Anarchism is the parochial, even patriarchal tradition of the monopolist, historical Anglo-Saxon bourgeoisie. They don't believe in anything. They're nihilists. They don't believe in states. They don't believe in anything. It's all meaningless. It's all arbitrary, whatever. Perfectly distilled. What is capitalism today, by the way? Is it not a form of anarchism? Is it not a form of economic anarchism where the pure institution, money, MCM prime. Money is what? Money is just the pure and indeterminate way which all things are subjected to a common measure, irregardless of their particular realities. This is how Marx describes it, right? Well, this has culminated in Anglo-Saxon financial capital. The zenith and pinnacle of the world capitalist system is the I. It's the I of financial capital. The I which subjects the entire world to the same abstract, indeterminate, common measure. Chinese are totalitarian. They're dictatorial. Same with the Russians. Why? Because they're grounding their economic reality in something human, something particular, something substantive. Not something pure and abstract and negative, something substantive in particular. They insist on something human, something real. something patriarchal in the strict sense of historical, traditional. This is Russia and China. That's their crime. This stamp and mark particularity. Now we should go and make our turn to bread tube. I feel like I'm missing so much, right? All of these people were ex-neo-Nazis. They're all ex-neo-Nazis because they have the same nihilistic position. Shouldn't we be tolerant of ex-neo-Nazis? I don't know if we should. I don't know if we have to pander to those people. I think those people are all upper middle class, nihilistic, lumpen, degenerate scum who don't represent any mainstream tendency among the masses. Now, the masses are disposed to conservatism, to paleo-conservative populism, yada, yada, yada. That's fine. We can work with that. Why should we work with Nazism? That's a degenerate lumpen phenomenon of the criminal lumpen, the criminal lumpen scum. They don't believe in anything. They don't respect anything human. It's all the same to them. It's all the same. This excess criminality of the ruling order. Criminality is not a way to defy the law. Criminality is the law. Criminality is the obscene reality of the bourgeois law, of the bourgeois state. These nihilists, these anti-human nihilists, we should see them indiscriminately. Neo-Nazis, so-called anarchists, they're all the same to us. Why don't Marxist-Leninists already see that? That's what I'm going to get into. Ladies and gentlemen, I have some bad news. In Western countries, Marxism and Marxism-Leninism is just a derivative form of anarchism. Now, they agree with the anarchists that everything's illegitimate and everything's fake and everything's illusory and everything's wrong, but we just need some extra steps, right? In a utilitarian way, we're going to use the state. We're going to use the political party. We're going to have all of these detours and all of these complications so we can return to the smooth world of anarchism where everything will be abolished and all negation will reign free on earth. All traditions will be destroyed. So it's just some extra steps. This is the basis of the anarchist critique of Marxism-Leninism. It's just not consistent enough. In the West, tankies, right? You're saying you're against the state, but you're going to have your own communist police? You're going to have your own communist state and communist commodities and communist, it's basically like communists are overcomplicating it. The pure thing is just being an anarchist, right? We started Infrared because we call for a new beginning for Marxism-Leninism in the West. The Western derangement that has given rise to the beginning for Marxism-Leninism of this pure nothingness, this nihil, this negation of all society and the world, either because you think it's unjust or inconsistent or whatever. This negative stance of modernistic abstractionism is a false beginning. I call for a new beginning of Marxism-Leninism that learns from the insights of the Chinese and the Russians and the non-Western Marxist-Leninists that allow them to derive the adobe, the clay out of which their Marxist-Leninist ideology is molded, not from an anarchist position of ultra-liberal negation, but from some substantive, particular civilizational humanity. I am not here to replace the libidinal fantasies and enjoyments of mass culture with libidinal fantasies of the enjoyment of great civilizations. We should revere and respect our deeper civilizational reality as something phenomenally remote from us rather than proximate. Our civilization is not something we can consume. It is our sublime reality, in the face of which we can only carefully, cautiously, but soberly distill into the concrete form of a people's consciousness. The premise of Marxist-Leninists the world over is not the anarchistic abolition of everything. The premise is the determinate, deep, telluric realities of the people, of your people, of the people in the country within which you were born, which you serve, which you've inherited, and of which you belong as a part of a greater whole. We have nothing in common with anarchists. Nothing. Our anti-capitalism has nothing in common. We oppose capitalism because capitalism is anarchist. We don't oppose capitalism because we're going to just artificially contrive our own society from scratch. We oppose capitalism because the very reality of history, the very reality of the winds of history, of the forces of production, and of the people have outmoded it fundamentally and on a scientific level. That is our stance as Marxist-Leninists in the West. But these Baiswo tankies who are abusing and misusing the legacy of Marxism-Leninism are trying to turn Marxism-Leninism into anarchism with some extra steps. No. Marxism and anarchism are qualitatively distinct. As Stalin put it in his own words, anarchism is our enemy. It is the enemy of the working class. We don't share similar principles with anarchists. We don't share the same end goal as anarchists, but with different steps and with different forms. There is a qualitative difference between us. We are human. We believe in humanity. We don't believe in nothingness. We don't believe in nothing. We don't believe in nihil. We believe there's something at the end of the tunnel. We believe there's something there. Even when it seems like capitalism has negated our entire reality, something still survives. Something is still there. We want to heed the call of that something that's still there. That's the beating heart of the people. That's what we as Marxist-Leninists represent. The beating heart of humanity. The beating heart of our countries, of our civilizations, of our peoples. That's what we represent. We don't represent nothingness. We don't represent negation. We don't represent abolition of everything. We represent not the abolition, but the affirmation of the people. We don't represent the abolition of history and of civilization, but the affirmation of true civilization. We don't represent the abolition of order, but the emergence, consolidation, and might of the true, real, and material order of humanity. That's what we represent. That's the meaning of Gorillas and Sons. So now you can understand why infrared has become the target of the left in the West. They think I'm a Nazbol or I'm a crypto fascist. I'm not a Nazbol. I'm not a crypto fascist. I've just come from a different beginning than you. You've come from the beginning of liberalism and negation. I've come from the beginning of the beating heart of humanity. I embrace humanity in all its wealth and all its depth. Yes, its countries, its nations, its cultures, its traditions, its histories, all of that. I begin from that. I don't begin with nothingness. I begin with somethingness. That's why we're different. Because they see me and they see that I represent a vital essence of Marxism, a living essence of Marxism, not a dead one, a living one. This isn't all a tool to realize some abstract end goal. It's not a tool. This is our end goal. It's humanity. But they see me say all this and they say he must be a fascist because he recognizes the people. He recognizes the living beating heart of humanity. He recognizes the living beating heart of nations and civilizations and traditions and cultures. So he must be a fascist. No, I'm not a fascist. You're a fucking fascist. You associated fascism with your fucking father. Your father was right. You associated fascism with the wrath of your father, with the wrath of your patria, of your country, of your forefathers, of your tradition, of your country. You associated fascism with all those things because you took the goddamn fascists at face value. You looked at what they were saying and assumed that's what they actually meant and that's actually what they represented, and it's not. They used all of those things as a disguise for the same nihilistic, political, liberal, modern psychosis that you derive your perverted form of Marxism-Leninism from. This wrath of the beating heart of humanity is not fascist. Fascism is the chicken shit, skinny little anarchist little bitch fuck who's trying to terrorize and attack humanity wearing his fucking mask like a goddamn Ku Klux Klan member, not able to fucking show himself in the light of day, penalizing and attacking like a criminal lumpen scum the American people and the peoples of all countries because they're not conforming to some politically correct, arbitrarily contrived set of rules. That's the fucking fascist. The fascist is the one who gatekeeps humanity. That's you. That's not me. I don't gatekeep anything. A priori and unconditionally, I embrace the peoples of the world. It doesn't matter where the fuck I am. I'm in Mexico, I'm in Colombia, I'm in India, I'm in Brazil, I'm in Russia, I'm in China, I'm in the Middle East, I'm in Europe. I don't give a fuck. You put me anywhere in the world. I'm in Africa. Put me anywhere in the world, and I'll respect the people in their land. I'll respect the meaning, beauty, and wealth of their humanity. I don't gatekeep people's humanity. But just because we live in this country and this is our country doesn't mean we have anything to be ashamed of. We should develop our particular humanity. We should assert and affirm our particular humanity. That doesn't mean we reject others or we hate others. It just means we're doing our own fucking thing. That's the best thing we could do for other people, is do our own thing. Contribute to the wealth of humanity. Contribute to the wealth of this world. We each represent a different form of humanity. We each represent a different form of the same universal humanity. We all represent different forms of that. The minute we compromise our nations, our countries, our pride, our particularity, the minute we compromise that, we have no access to universal humanity. Only by fully affirming our particular humanity can we be universal human beings and actually coexist with others and form relations with others and trade with others and understand each other. Chinese don't understand you goddamn leftists. You forsake your own country, you forsake your own people. They don't fucking understand you. He said, why don't you go churches? Why don't you go to those Trump people? Why don't you go embrace your people? And they say, no, because America is against you, China. I said, against us, we're Chinese. You're not Chinese. You're a fucking American. So be a goddamn American, because I can't understand you as a human being when you're pretending to speak on behalf of everybody. That's what Marxism-Leninism in the age of multipolarity means, ladies and gentlemen. Call me a fascist. They called me a fascist from day fucking one when I came onto the stage, when I came onto the scene, for this very reason. This is why they did it. This is why they called me a fascist. I am a fucking American. I don't care what anyone tells me. Hans, you're an Arab. You're not an American. Hans, you're a foreigner. You're a Lebanese guy. You're not. No, I am a fucking American. I'm an American because America is the primordial myth of my unconscious. I don't have a home except this. America's problem is my fucking problem. So if America goes to shit, I'm going to shit. I have the same fate as America. I'm a part of this country. Whatever this country becomes, I'm a part of it. It is what I fucking am. There's no Haas. There's no fucking Haas. There's no story of who I fucking am that doesn't include the wider context of this country. And that doesn't make me a fucking fascist. It doesn't make me a fascist to embrace my own humanity. What makes me human? Are you saying America is what makes human? Yes, because this is where I was from. There's no human Haas. There's no Haas person without this. How could I forsake my own country when this is the country that fed me, that clothed me, that sheltered me, that created me? This is my country. There's no Haas that exists without it. Well, what if you were born in another country? Then that would be my country. What if I was born to a different mother? It's the same fucking thing. I wasn't born in Russia. There's part of my soul that I feel is Russian because of how deeply attached I am to Russian literature and culture and history. But at the end of the day, I'm not Russian. I'm American. Same with China. I'm not Chinese. I'm American. I'm not Indian. I'm American. I'm ethnically, I guess, it's part of my background. My parents are from Lebanon. That's just a flavor on top of this shit. I'm just a type of American. That's exactly it, Johnny. They say, I hate everything about America except the policing of the world. I like that part. People always try to tell me this is a racist country, a racist, white supremacist, that this is an Anglo-supremacist, evil, racist country. I'm not going to deny the evil of this country, especially in the past and in its history. When I see ordinary American people, my people, when I look into their eyes, I see the same fucking American naivety and ignorance that I see when I look in the mirror. I just see a blank slate. I see people who are innocent on a fundamental level. I see people who aren't burdened with any inherent prejudices or any inherent evil or any inherent dispositions. As a matter of fact, 99% of the time when Americans are being racist, they're just being ignorant. They're just saying, whoa, I don't know. And then they're not self-aware or they're not aware or educated enough. But malice and hatred, I don't think that comes from this soil. I think that's a relic of the British Empire, that rotten British Empire. And I think it's a poison that comes from above, not below, from our disgusting ruling class, from our sick and disgusting ruling class. We Americans, we've perfected the art of ignoring each other. It's beautiful. And we've also perfected the art coming together and forming real communities. Real ones, too. That's something you don't see anywhere else in the world. You don't see that anywhere else in the world. I'm going to tell you guys a story. This is not anything profound, but it's just an example of this, right? It's a story. I was at a survival horror camp. We're doing this overnight camp at this place in the woods where there was tents and stuff. It was a big disaster. It was like Fire Fest, but for Halloween survival horror, right? There was these actors that were hired to come and scare us and having a good time camping out, whatever. And, a lot of working class people at this thing, right? This is happening like somewhere in Flint, whatever. And I want to do it again. I want to have Jackson come sometime in the fall and do it again, right? But there was this time when we were there And this was like the first one they did. It was like a big disaster. There wasn't enough food for everyone, and everyone wanted to leave because it was like boring and it was overcrowded. So everybody left and the buses took everybody, but some of us got left behind because there wasn't enough room for us. Keep in mind, this was like an overnight thing. There's no warmth, there's no fireplace, there's nothing. It's cold as fuck, right? And so there's about like 12 of us that are remaining. Me, two of my friends, and then a bunch of other random people. And it's pitch black and we can't see each other. So we all get around this one campsite that was there, and we managed to get a fire going, but we still can't see each other, right? We're there for hours. And even though we were all strangers and we all came from different backgrounds, it was such a nice sense of community. Like, people were helping each other. There was men and women both, and they're mostly older too. There's a mixture of young and old, not too young, but like my age and then boomers. And it's everyone's like a family now for like this whole night. Everyone's acting like a family, and we're all, together. We don't even know who the fuck we don't know each other. We don't know anything about each other. We're sharing stories, whatever. And I just feel like that's a really small example of something I think you have in this country you don't really have in other countries. Because we're just all united by like our ignorance. We're united by like, what the fuck is going on? We don't know what the fuck's going on here. When is the bus coming? But in the meantime, let's make the best of what we can do and survive, I guess, and make a fire and make food and help out with whatever. I feel like that's what America is. We're not better or worse than any other country. We're just different, right? I think America's a country where strangers can come together and figure out what makes a people, what makes a state. But anyway, we're not a type of fascist. Marxism, Leninism comes from all the contradictions within Marxism, Leninism, that's not utilitarian. We don't believe in to use the state and use this and use that to arrive at the anarchist end. We don't know what the end is going to be. Marx said communism is the real movement, not an ideal. We can speculate about what is not going to exist, but in terms of what it affirmatively looks like, we don't know anything about that. Nothing. We're not doing this to realize some individual vision. We're doing it to honor and carry forward the torch of humanity across history. And our dialectic method, where we unite contraries, we don't take anarchism as some base and then Marxism, Leninism is just some extra steps. No, that dialectic is ancient. That's the ancient tradition of humanity. Whether it's dualism, whether it's religion, whether it's Christianity, whether it's Islam, whether it's Judaism, it doesn't matter what it is, whether it's the Dharmic religions, that dialectic is common to all humanity, not the least of which includes our own. So it's not a detour and it's not some kind of extra steps. A stateless, moneyless, classless society, that doesn't mean anything. That doesn't mean anything. There's no affirmative meaning to that at all. That's not our end goal. We don't know what our end goal is. We don't have an end goal. We are trying to carry forward the torch of humanity through history. We don't have an end goal. Our goal is to serve the people. Our goal is the power of the people. That's our goal. Our goal is to awaken the people to realize their destiny. That's our goal. We don't know what that destiny is. We are with the people in our blindness before the future. We just want the people to get their shit together, overthrow this inhuman system and these anti-human elites so we could realize our inner potential and flourish in our creative abilities that we can unlock and unleash. That's all it fucking means. We don't form as a subject of capital, dude. Stop fucking reading your situationist international French fart dumb shit. Dumbass leftcom shit. We're not a subject of capital. Capital's nothing. Capital is just MCM. It's a process that arises from a particular universalism of Anglo-Saxon modernity, according to which everything is held to the common standard. Yeah, the way that's overcome is through particularity, which is what I'm fucking talking about. You're not a subject of capital, you're a subject of nothingness. We are not subjects of capital. We are subjects, this is the threat it poses, of nothingness. And the threat we face is existential. We face a post-human future of the end of humanity as we know it. That's what we're facing. The end of humanity as we know it. We face the end of humanity as we know it. Americans are unquestioning about how we're bonded by imperialism. We're not bonded by anything. We're not bonded by anything, dude. We are bounded by nothing. Nothing that matters as far as it's relevant to us anyway. The thing that we're bound by is the thing we're in love with, which is it's our humanity. We're only bound by our own humanity. That's it. We're not bounded by imperialism. We're not bounded by capitalism. We're not bounded by any of that shit. You're just bounded by your ability to disseminate your special consciousness to ordinary people, which is a shortcoming of your consciousness, not the people themselves. If all anarchists want is a voluntary, because there's no community of individuals that's contrived through voluntary contracts and acting in their own self-interests, because our self is partial. Part of what we are is the state. Part of what we are is society. Part of what we are is our obligation to something bigger than ourselves. That is part of what we are. So the self in question is not actually a true self that you're talking about. It's a false selfhood of an idol. The idol being the nihil and nothingness of modernity. I'm going to conclude with this, guys. Hitler was an anarchist. For no other reason that for him, contradictions internal to liberal statehood would be reified as the foundation and object of his aesthetic. One-sided negation, not particular views about authority, coercion, and hierarchy and egalitarianism, but one-sided negation that defines the essence of anarchism. That is why fascism and anarchism are of one and the same essence.